Welcome to our program, Professor Kimmage.
Thank you so much for having me.
US President Joe Biden will visit Germany this week and will meet with European leaders, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and also the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer. Leaders would discuss the war in Ukraine and support for Ukraine. Do you expect any kind of major decisions in support for Ukraine before the US general election and during this crucial week?
No, I think that there's no way that 3 weeks before an election, and especially one where there's such a big difference between the two political parties, there's no way that there'll be a new initiative at the moment. It is possible, perhaps, that if President Biden can see Kamala Harris as vice president to victory in November, that in that period, sort of November, December, there might be some reconsiderations and new decisions. But even then, I wouldn't expect, if Kamala Harris becomes president, I wouldn't expect her to make any major decisions about assistance to Ukraine until January and February after the inauguration.
Also, there have been some speculations that President Biden could allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with Western-made weapons after the U.S. general election and before the January 20. What is your take on that?
I think it's very unlikely. One feature of President Biden, which you see in Israel, as well as Ukraine and in other theaters, is that he's quite stubborn and doesn't seem to change his mind easily or quickly. And on this point, he's been quite consistent. So I would be very surprised if there were big changes in that regard after the election.
Do you expect the UK government to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia on its own without the same decision from the United States?
I think it's possible, maybe slightly unlikely, but I think it's possible. I think Britain has been perfectly capable of independent decision-making, and Britain, of all European countries, is the one that's most comfortable with the projection of military force, vis-a-vis Russia and concerning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's certainly a distinct possibility.
What is your take on the current mood of the Western allies regarding the support for Ukraine? There have been some speculations and reports about the possible negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. What do you make of it?
I think it's important to see the big picture in this regard. There have been some recent regional elections in Germany where parties unsympathetic to Ukraine have done fairly well. That's only in Eastern Germany. And certainly not a national trend in Germany. And of course, you have a very big debate in the United States about the amount of funding and military support to give to Ukraine. That's one of the issues that the presidential election is going to be about. And that's, possibly a new beginning or a new chapter in U.S. policy toward Ukraine. But the big picture reality is that there's a very high level of support still for Ukraine. And I think that for decision makers, populations of Western countries are all a bit different in this point, but for decision makers, nobody wants to repeat the naive mistakes of 2013, 2014, 2015, Minsk diplomacy and the kind of compromises that were made back then, which were followed by a massive Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I don't think anybody wants to repeat that pattern. And so in that sense, while there will be some degree of contact or diplomacy between Western powers and Russia, I don't think that there's any serious Western leader at the moment who's pressing for a negotiated settlement or a quick negotiated settlement. Again, politics can change in some of the countries, including the United States, and that might become a conversation this spring, but it's not the conversation that's being held at the present moment.
Wall Street Journal reported that Ukraine could be invited to join NATO in exchange of a ceasefire with Russia. What is your personal opinion about such idea to pause the war in Ukraine?
I think it's very far from being the political reality in Washington. In Germany, where I am currently, I think that's also the case, not to mention countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and Turkey, which are NATO members, and I don't think are enthusiastic about the idea of Ukraine joining the alliance. I think a much better frame for the conversation, a more realistic and more effective frame for the conversation, is the conversation about security guarantees to Ukraine, which exist already to some degree US, UK, and other countries. And I think that's a foundation on which a lot can be built. Maybe that will equal the exact same thing as NATO membership, a kind of Article 5 commitment, but it might not be called NATO. So I think there's a lot that can be done. There are a lot of commitments that can be made to Ukraine that are meaningful and that might help Ukraine to get past this phase of the war. But the politics of NATO in many of the key countries are really very, very difficult. I don't think even if President Biden would propose NATO membership, let's imagine between the election and the third week of January, when a new president will come to the White House, even if President Biden were to propose that, the U.S. Senate is very unlikely to approve. There are Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Senate who I think would vote against that. So the politics are tricky, but there are other ways of solving the problem.
Former US President Donald Trump says that he would end the war in Ukraine as a president-elect, even if he is going to be elected. What is your take on that, and how could Trump deal with Zelensky and Putin after the general election in case of his, if he wins this election? Can he really influence the war in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine even before the inauguration?
I don't think that he can influence the war in a big way. Certainly as president, he would have lots of control over sanctions, over military spending, over American diplomacy, and all of that could change the feeling of things. It could change the environment from what we currently have under President Biden. Let's think back, though, to 2016. At that time, when Donald Trump ran for president, the first time around, he made a lot of big promises or big claims about Ukraine. He was going to make a deal with Putin about Crimea. He was going to destroy the NATO alliance. There are a lot of things that Trump said on the campaign trail in 2016 that had very little bearing on his actual presidency, and I think this is one of those. This is one of those points. So Trump will certainly not end the war in 24 hours. I don't think that Trump has the credibility in Ukraine. He would have to earn it, but he doesn't have the credibility in Ukraine to do real diplomacy. The key actor in diplomacy on the war is, of course, Ukraine. So the United States can have an opinion. It can push Ukraine to do certain things, but it's in the end up to Ukraine to decide how it conducts its business. And if Trump would want to see a quick end to the war or major concessions to Russia, I think there are a lot of countries in Europe that would really disagree with that. Poland, Baltic republics for sure, Sweden, Finland, and I would imagine also France, Germany, and the UK. So what Trump could do is scale back US support for Ukraine. That would have consequences, but that doesn't mean that Europe would also scale back support. In fact, Europe might escalate support for Ukraine under a Trump presidency. And in that sense, a kind of quick negotiated settlement is even more difficult to imagine. So I understand this language to be campaign language, and I simply would not take it as a guide to how Donald Trump would govern or how he would operate on the international stage.
If Donald Trump is elected, it would be probably his last term as US president. Do you feel that this situation, as it would be his last presidency, could let him to do what he really wants in case of Ukraine without depending on the voters, without lining and depending on the opinion of his voters, his Republican Party? What is your take of this?
No, I mean, it's true that if he were to be reelected, it would be his second and last term. I mean, he's spoken about a third term, and it's possible that Trump could step down or resign, and then J.D. Vance could become president, and then it could be a two-term presidency under those circumstances. But I don't think that Trump is very free to act for two reasons. I don't think that Trump knows what he wants with Ukraine. He wants peace. He wants the war to be over. In a sense, everybody wants that. That's an easy thing to wish for. But I think Trump has no idea how to get there. He doesn't have an agenda. He doesn't have a clear set of priorities. He's spoken in no detail about this in the presidential debate on the campaign trail. So, to do what he wants, he has to know what he wants. And I think that that's just not where he is on Ukraine. He has certain phrases that he uses, but not a strategy and not a vision. But it's also the case, and we want to think back again to the first Trump term in this regard, that an American president's powers are considerable, but they're also very limited. And Congress is, according to the U.S. Constitution, a co-equal branch of government. So Congress can form its own foreign policy. And for example, in the first Trump term, Trump wanted to get rid of sanctions on Russia, and Republicans in Congress increased the sanctions on Russia. And so, there too, Trump has to operate within the constraints of the American political system. And on this issue, Russia, Ukraine, Trump does not have the complete or full support of his party. That's especially true in the U.S. Senate, which is a powerful decision-making body. And so I think Trump would struggle. And my guess is Trump would end up just not doing all that much on Ukraine, which might be bad in its own terms, but would be different from some big change or revolution in American policy.
What do you expect from Republicans in Congress? I mean, after the U.S. general election, after they would be going to be elected, do you expect them to hold Ukraine aid as it was before?
Not easy to predict. There are two trends, and it depends on the election as to which trend is going to be the more important one. If you go back to congressional elections over the last 4, 6, 8 years, the Republicans who have done best are those who are quote unquote moderate, not sort of extreme. And the moderate Republicans are supportive of Ukraine. They certainly voted in large numbers to grant the supplemental this past summer. And traditionally, moderate Republicans are, the party of Ronald Reagan, with the Cold War in the background, and a strong suspicion of Moscow. So that's one trend line, and the 2024 election could confirm that trend line. You could get a larger number of moderates, Republican moderates in the House and in the Senate, in which case I think that would be good news for Ukraine. But the other trend, which goes in the other direction, is that Trump has gained more control over the Republican Party. And he's shaped the Republican Party to be more of a party in his image. And there it's clear that the priority is competition with China. And the other priority is spending less on defense. And a third priority is getting Europe to spend more on its security and defense. And all of that makes for difficulty when it comes to supporting Ukraine. So if that trend line gets confirmed, that more Trump-like figures enter the Congress, as Republicans, then that's bad news for Ukraine. I wouldn't be able to predict which of these two trend lines is going to predominate, but there are two separate and conflicting trend lines when it comes to the Republican Party and Ukraine.
Let's cover also the politics in Germany. We have heard some reports about the possible problems, issues with support for Ukraine in the next year from the German government. What is your take on that? And do you expect Germany to realize its commitments to make all what German Chancellor Olaf Scholz promised to Ukraine?
Well, this is difficult. I don't expect Germany to go back in a big way on the promises that it's made. Scholz remains strongly committed to Ukrainian security. And very likely, if you fast forward maybe 8-9 months in German politics, the next Chancellor of Germany is not going to be Olaf Scholz. It would be Friedrich Merz from the Christian Democratic Party. And Friedrich Merz is a very vocal supporter of Ukraine, and the Christian Democrats are traditionally, I don't know if anti-Russian is the right word, but traditionally a party that supports European security and is willing to be tough on Russia. So that's one thread in the story, and I think that's important to remember. The regional elections are probably less significant than the fact that the CDU and Friedrich Merz look ready to take control next year. But everything in Germany depends on the kinds of coalitions that are formed, and the current coalition has the Liberal Party, the FDP, which is obsessed with what's in Germany called the debt brake. And with reducing spending, and that's made it very difficult not only to get high levels of support for Ukraine, but even to pay for the commitments that the government has already made. And so Germany is struggling in that regard, and you can see budgetary patterns that are not good in terms of support for Ukraine. That's not an ideological point so much. It's not that the FDP, the Liberal Party in Germany, is anti-Ukraine. It's just very concerned about finances and debt and such. But that's created something of a gridlock or an impasse in Germany. And the result is just a very, very slow pace of acting on the commitments that Germany has already made. So I would describe that as a pretty frustrating situation.
You also have mentioned Friedrich Merz. He could become the next Chancellor of Germany. Recently, he said that he could allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with German-made Taurus missiles in case if Putin refuses to stop attacking civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Do you feel that he could repeat the statement after the German general election?
Absolutely. I think that that's entirely possible. Merz is not shy when it comes to the question of Ukrainian security, and I think that that's fairly credible. Once again, though, everything will depend on the coalition. If the CDU, the Christian Democrats, are able to form a coalition with the Green Party, which is one of the possible outcomes in September 2025, when Germans will have their election, I think that that's entirely conceivable. The Green Party is also highly supportive of Ukraine at the present moment, and it would be in a coalition with the Christian Democrats. If the Christian Democrats have to form a big coalition with the Social Democrats or come up with some other construct to get into power, then it could be considerably more difficult. Then, Merz might make these promises and then find it difficult to follow through on the commitment to them. So, the coalition is sort of everything in German politics, and that's impossible to predict, but that would either be an enabling or a limiting factor for Friedrich Merz.
North Korea could deploy troops to Ukraine. Ukrainian media reported that 3 or even 10,000 North Korean soldiers are being trained inside Russia, and Russia prepares to deploy such troops to the battlefield in Ukraine to fight against the Ukrainian army alongside with Russian forces. Also, some media reported that such troops could be deployed to the border regions between Ukraine and Russia to help Russia to protect its own border while Ukraine is continuing its operation inside the Kursk region. Do you feel that the West is ready to put more pressure on North Korea to stop such high-level cooperation, to stop this even escalation in the cooperation between Russia and North Korea?
Well, I'm sure that in Washington and elsewhere, people would be happy to put more pressure on North Korea. This is a very negative development for the war. And who knows what North Korea is going to get in return from Russia. It could be nuclear technology, it could be other things that are deeply, deeply damaging to Western interests in the region. So I don't think that there's any reluctance to place pressure on North Korea. The problem is that the West has almost no leverage on North Korea. The level of sanctions is extraordinarily high. North Korea is completely isolated. So in some respects, that means that North Korea is free to act and free to go against Ukrainian interests, free to go against Western interests without too much fear of punishment or retribution. But the will to sanction North Korea or to make North Korea's life more difficult because of this, I'm sure, is there. One additional point I'd like to make, though, that ominous as this development is, negative as this development is, it does point up manpower shortages on the Russian side. If Russia had millions of soldiers on which to draw through conscription, through contracts, Russia wouldn't have to turn to North Korea. So it is a sign of something seriously going wrong on the Russian war effort, and that's another way of interpreting the presence of these North Koreans who are now sort of appearing near the front lines of the conflict. It's something of an insight into the challenges of the war effort on the Russian side. I think in our media culture in Germany and the US, there's a lot of focus now in this coming difficult winter on the challenges that Ukraine faces. I think there's too little focus on the challenges that Russia faces, and that's one of the things that this helps us to understand, this North Korean element.
Do you see this as an act of war from North Korea to Ukraine? Because North Korea could become the third party of this war. What does it mean from a political point of view? And do you expect the West to retaliate to North Korea, to have some bold response?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it sort of rises to that level. And certainly for Washington, I wouldn't maybe speak for Europe in this regard, but for Washington, there are now two huge-scale crises. I mean, there's the war in Ukraine that we've been talking about, but there's also the crisis in the Middle East, where Israel's going to make some kind of reprisal against Iran in the next few days or the next weeks. U.S. just deployed some missiles and a few troops to Israel. You have real concerns about shipping in the Red Sea with the Houthis there. And so I don't think that anybody at this moment wants to add a third major crisis to that. I think two crises are probably the very maximum that the U.S. can handle at the present moment. So if there's a way, practically speaking, to punish North Korea for entering the war, that will hopefully be found. But beyond that, I don't think it would change the bigger overall global dynamics.
But don't you think that U.S. government's hesitation to respond to the North Korea's deployment to Ukraine could only allow North Korea and let Pyongyang to deploy even more troops to Ukraine and to dramatically change the situation on the ground in Ukraine?
It's entirely possible. I just don't think that there's any will in Washington to sort of escalate or to make a military tension between, or create a military crisis or a set of military tensions between the U.S. and North Korea. And as I said a moment ago, I think it's less about maybe Ukraine, less about North Korea, and more about the U.S. being very stretched thin at this moment in terms of the Middle East and what could be a regional war in the Middle East.
But should the West, instead of punishing North Korea, escalating this situation, should the West, in response to such a deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine, provide Ukraine with additional support and allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia? Don't you think that this could be an appropriate response to the recent North Korean actions?
Yeah, I think that wouldn't be persuasive for the Biden administration. I think that they feel, that the issue of long-range weapons has two dimensions to it that make it very difficult to support giving U.S. weapons to Ukraine for strikes deep within Russia. And part of that is, as the Biden administration has said many times, concerns about escalation between Russia and the United States. But there are also a host of logistical issues that are at play there. And I just don't see the North Korean troops being so significant as to change that calculus for the Biden White House. So I think that the Biden White House, and this could be right or this could be wrong, that they perceive these as two quite different problem sets. The nature of military assistance to Ukraine, what's the U.S. is willing to allow and not allow, and North Korea's involvement in the conflict. I think these operate as two quite different problem sets.
But if North Korea deploys even more significant amount of soldiers to the front line in Ukraine, could the U.S. respond to this?
I'm just not sure. I think it's possible that there wouldn't be much of a response.
Thank you, Professor Kimmage, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.